Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Welcome to the program, friends. Wherever you are, from Thunder Bay to the Carolinas and Maine to Minnesota, good to have you aboard. I'm still picking the corn silk out of my teeth. I had some of the most amazing sweet corn. The Mighty Aphrodite and I went up to one of the farmers' markets not too far from where we live, north of Toronto in Thornhill. And this place is just incredible. The produce right off of the farm and like right out back. And the corn, $7 they were charging for a dozen. Can you believe that, David Gaskin? $7 a dozen? Have you ever seen prices like that? But you know what? The Mighty Aphrodite, she says, this is why we work, right? We work to eat, and we're going to eat properly. And it's I don't know that it's entirely organic, but they advertise it as the sweetest corn you're ever going to taste, and my word, it was delicious. And just the bounty. I've never seen eggplants, or aubergine, as we like to call them, this large, and okra, and just amazing. Garlic. Very expensive, though, but we're willing to pay that because we like, when we can, we like to buy local, and we like to support our Ontario farmers. And when I go grocery shopping with the Mighty Aphrodite, we enjoy grocery shopping. But let me tell you, it's a trip with her, because if she doesn't see Ontario produce, she goes right to the back and she demands to see the manager, and she will give him what for. She'll say, why aren't these potatoes from Ontario? It's harvest time, right? We should have local produce. And they'll sort of shrug and look down at their feet and look very uncomfortable. And she just gives them hell. And good for her. So the other day, she says, here's an article. It's a press release. You should read this, and then you should tweet it. She actually does a lot of my tweeting. And you can follow the tweets at twitter.com/Richard Syrett, all one word. And this is a press release from the folks out in California who are behind something called Proposition 37. And this is, they want to force the big food companies to divulge what's in their products. So if there are things like genetically modified ingredients or organisms in the food, they want that on the label, which seems reasonable. So this press release, she's tweeted it. Let me just crib here. Released on Monday, August 13th. Big pesticide food companies spend $10 million to fight honest food labels. New campaign finance reports show that pesticide and processed food companies just contributed nearly $10 million to oppose Proposition 37, which would require labeling of genetically engineered foods. We're going to find out what those are in just a moment. According to the California Secretary of State disclosure forms, the largest of these contributions came from DuPont, Bayer, Crop Science, and BASF, Plant Science. Other contributions include $500,000 each from Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Nestle, General Mills, and ConAgra. Quote, these corporations are desperate to keep us from finding out what's really in our food, end quote, said Stacy Melkin, media director for California Right to Know. They will not prevail. This is America. We have the right to know what's in the food we eat and feed our children, end quote. Well, hear. The huge contributions from pesticide and seed companies, now topping $7 million with the new donations, shine light on a little known fact about genetically engineered foods. Rather than reducing the need for hazardous pesticides, herbicide-resistant seeds have driven a massive increase in herbicide use that has been linked to significant environmental and public health concerns, explains Marcia Ishii-Eitman, Ph.D. senior scientist at Pesticide Action Network, in a statement supporting Proposition 37. It's clear that genetically engineered herbicide-resistant seeds are the growth engines of the pesticide industry's sales and marketing strategy. These seeds are part of a technology package explicitly designed to facilitate increased indiscriminate herbicide use and pump up chemical sales. So, we're going to discuss honest food labeling, and more specifically, genetically engineered food or genetically engineered organisms, Frankenfood, some people call it. And we're going to do that right here and now. Jeffrey M. Smith is an international best-selling author and the leading spokesman on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. He documents how the world's most powerful agricultural biotech companies bluff and mislead critics and put the health of society at risk. His first book, Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of the genetically engineered foods you're eating, became the world's best-selling and #1 rated book on GMOs. His second book, Genetic Roulette, The Documented Health Risks of Genetically Engineered Foods, is the authoritative work that presents irrefutable evidence that GMOs are harmful. Jeffrey Smith, welcome to the Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Great, thank you.
What are GMOs? Let's start with a definition.
Well, you take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species. So you have genes from bacteria that are forced into soybeans, allowing the soybean plants to not die when sprayed with Roundup herbicide. They're called Roundup Ready soybeans. You have corn that's genetically engineered to produce its own insecticide that breaks open the stomach of insects to kill them. It's in the corn that we eat. So it's mixing and matching genes between species, and even the process itself causes massive collateral damage and might cause new toxins, allergens, or carcinogens into the food, but these are not evaluated before they get put on the market.
How prevalent are genetically engineered ingredients in the foods we eat? I guess it's hard to know because we don't have proper labeling.
Exactly. It would be great to have labeling, and if we did, we'd realize that if the food was processed, then it's probably 9 out of 10 packaged processed foods that contain one of the 9 genetically modified food crops. Soy and corn in particular, canola oil, especially in Canada, cottonseed oil, as well as sugar from sugar beets. Those are the main ones.
So if we often hear the term they're Roundup Ready, which means that these plants are genetically, soy and corn and others, are genetically modified so that they will take as much Roundup herbicide as you can throw at them. Is that the idea?
Pretty much. In other words, instead of having to worry about hurting your plants when you are putting on the weed killer, you just spray right over the top. The plants drink the weed killer and store a lot of it right in the food portion that we end up eating. And of course, Roundup is not the benign herbicide that Monsanto tried to lead us to believe. It turns out it's linked to cancer and Parkinson's and birth defects and problems with estrogen and testosterone production, and may be responsible for the horrific reproductive disorders found in lab animals fed Roundup Ready crops.
So corn, soy, which, as you indicate, end up in feed for livestock and chickens and things like that. Mm-hmm. What other plants or organisms are genetically modified and used in the food business?
So in corn, cotton, canola, sugar from sugar beets, papaya from Hawaii or China, zucchini, yellow crookneck squash, and alfalfa used for hay. These are the only genetically modified food-related crops right now.
Now, would these food giants that produce these GMOs, DuPont and Monsanto, which is interesting because those companies originally were in the herbicide and pesticide business, correct?
And they still are. You see, it's a big opportunity for them to sell lots more chemicals if they sell the seeds that require the use of those chemicals.
So is Monsanto and DuPont, are they trying to bring in more than these 9 plants that you indicated? Would they like to expand the types of plants that are GMOs?
Indeed, Monsanto's stated goal, as reported by its consultant in a 1999 biotech conference in San Francisco, was to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds in the world, own the patents for those seeds, and sell the associated chemicals. In fact, at the same conference, another company projected that within 5 years, 95% of all commercial seeds would be genetically engineered. Now, they fortunately have not met that time schedule. Consumer resistance and a tipping point of consumer resistance in Europe in particular has stopped that timetable almost in its tracks. But virtually every fruit and vegetable and grain and bean that is common has been genetically engineered and is in some place in the pipeline. But it gets worse because there's now mosquitoes that have been released that are genetically engineered. There's a group that wants to introduce genetically engineered fish and livestock and trees. And so basically they're looking to replace nature, cutting off the billions of years of evolution and create man-made combinations with unpredicted side effects, basically designer nature, man designing nature rather than nature expressing it from its own wisdom.
Jeffrey Smith is with us here on The Conspiracy Show, the author of Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of the genetically engineered foods you're eating, and also Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods. And the website is responsibletechnology.org. Check it out. I've linked to it on my website at richardsyrett.com. Now, Monsanto and DuPont, they would argue, I'm guessing, Jeffrey, that with 7 billion people on the planet, the only way we're going to be able to feed everyone is to increase crop yields, and the only way to do that is to genetically modify them.
Well, that's the public relations spin, and it's completely wrong. It turns out that the most comprehensive evaluation of how to feed the world, done by more than 400 scientists, signed on by 58 countries, sponsored by the UN and 11 other major transnational organizations, said that the current generation of GMOs has nothing to offer feeding the hungry world. In fact, the average GM crop reduces yield. It concentrates the ownership of seeds and the control of agriculture into few multinationals. It hurts biodiversity. It removes the independence of farmers. It increases the use of agricultural chemicals and dependence on inputs. And they said things like agroecology, which have a huge opportunity for not only increasing yields but also eradicating poverty and establishing sustainable agriculture, are far more appropriate. So this concept that it's needed to feed the world is complete bogusness. In fact, we have more food per person than any time in human history, and it's not actually yields that are needed, it's access to the food, because even with the ability to feed 11 billion people today, 1 billion go to bed hungry or malnourished every night.
Interesting. A case in point, we're told that this is a horrible drought we're experiencing, and it's really going to hurt the corn farmers and corn production. We're going to see food prices, because corn is in everything. It's going to go sky high in the next year. But having said all that, this is the 4th largest corn yield in history. So there's some obvious credence in what you're saying. Listen, Jeff, stay with us. We'll take a timeout, come back, and continue to delve into genetically modified organisms. What's in the food you're eating?
From Yeti to Nessie, pyramids to pandemics, all is revealed on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Welcome back. Jeffrey Smith is with us, the author of Seeds of Deception and Genetic Roulette. We're talking about genetically modified organisms. And the future is here, and it's not always pretty. A couple of weeks ago, the news broke that scientists had created essentially a new life form. They took the cell of out of a rat's heart, and they created a squid. Do you remember, David, I was telling you about this? And I remember your reaction. You said, they're doing this now? They're able to do... Yes, we are creating new life forms. And about 10 years ago, I had a conversation with an author by the name of Frank Ogden. He was a futurist. They call him Dr. Tomorrow. I don't know if he's still with us, but he was telling me about how they've taken cells from, let's say, a groundfish like a halibut. And they, of course, live in the deep Atlantic Ocean near the floor. It's incredibly cold down there. They've taken a cell from this, or a gene, I guess, from this groundfish, and they've put it in either durum wheat or winter wheat that's grown out in Alberta. And so now this wheat is able to withstand colder temperatures. Now, Jeffrey, I thought at the time, well, that's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. I mean, is that the sort of thing, does that concern you when they're doing, I mean, what's the danger of that?
Well, the very process itself of insertion of a gene into a new genome and cloning the cell into a plant can cause hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA. Up to 5% of the naturally functioning genes can change their levels of expression. So, for example, there's a corn engineered to produce its own toxic insecticide, but it also has 43 other proteins that are either dramatically increased or decreased. And one of those is a new allergen, which is not found in corn normally, but in Monsanto's genetically engineered corn, there's now a gene that's switched on that produces an allergen. But that's just the background noise. what they're putting into crops is not necessarily benign. For example, the Bt toxin, which is designed to break open holes in the cell walls of the stomach of insects to kill them, the biotech industry and Health Canada and the FDA and EPA said that, don't worry, the Bt toxin produced inside the corn is destroyed in the digestive tract of humans and mammals. But in Canada last year, at Sherbrooke University Hospital, they found that the Bt toxin survived digestion and ended up in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested and 80% of their unborn fetuses. But according to Health Canada and the biotech industry, don't worry because the Bt toxin only affects cells in insects. But that was until this year when the Journal of Applied Toxicology extracted the Bt toxin from Monsanto's corn, applied it to human cells, and found that it pokes holes in human cells too, causing leakage. So we have a toxin which can poke holes in human cells in the food supply, and it gets through our intestines into our blood and into the blood of the infants, and they have no blood-brain barrier developed. It could be on their brains.
So where were the long-term studies before these organisms, genetically modified plants, were approved by the FDA and Health Canada? I asked sarcastically.
Well, the scientists at the FDA had urged their superiors to acquire just that. We have the documents. They were made public from a lawsuit. They warned of allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They said it deserves human studies, long-term toxicological studies. But the person in charge of policy at the FDA was the former attorney of biotech giant Monsanto, later Monsanto's vice president, now the U.S. Food Safety Czar.
Oh, this is too rich.
So that guy said no safety testing is necessary, no labeling is necessary, that Monsanto, the same company that told us that PCBs, Agent Orange, and DDT were safe, can determine that GMOs are safe and put it on the market without telling the FDA or consumers.
And now they're fighting honest labeling in the food business.
And Monsanto just dropped $4.2 million, raising the total bucket of trying to stop labeling in California to $25 million, and that's just the beginning. So these companies are trying to confuse voters by saying that labeling is confusing. They're spending more money than they'd ever spend on labeling, saying that labeling is too expensive. So it is a complete whitewash, but it's going to be a very expensive whitewash. Right now, about 70% of voters in California are in favor of labeling, in favor of Prop 37. We'll see what happens after 2 months of a $100 million disinformation campaign.
Well, I have an idea what's going to happen, Jeffrey. See if you agree. Let's say the initiative is approved, and therefore then it goes on the ballot, I guess, during the next state election, correct?
Well, it is approved. It's on the ballot.
Okay, so let's say the voters vote for it. Proposition 37 is approved at the ballot box. Well, given that the incredible elephant in the room, this conflict of interest, where you have FDA officials who were formerly working for Monsanto, this doesn't stand a chance. I mean, even if it's approved by the voters, it'll never see the light of day.
Well, here's the thing: the only two bullets that they can fire is a lawsuit. But the bill was designed so it was rock solid. It has law on its side, and then they can go to the feds and try and preempt it, so no state can pass a labeling law. And that's getting more and more unpopular because what's happening is this. There's now thousands of doctors in North America prescribing non-GMO diets. There's evidence of enormous reproductive disorders, immune system problems, gastrointestinal problems related to GMOs, and people are getting better from these symptoms when they switch to non-GMO diets, as are livestock and pets. And even the American Academy of Environmental Medicine urges all doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets, saying that these categories of disease are found in the lab animals that are experimented with and fed GMOs. So there's more and more of a groundswell of concern about the health risks associated with eating GMOs, and that has resulted in non-GMO labels being one of the fastest-growing label claims in America for the past 3 years, and it's resulted in 19 states introducing labeling bills into their legislature within the last 12 months. None have gotten past Monsanto's influence peddling and threats of lawsuits, but this demonstrates a change in the collective consciousness moving in the direction of greater awareness about GMOs. And we know where that leads because we saw that in Europe. When Europeans were alerted to the concerns about GMOs by scientists, The tipping point of consumer rejection was swift and complete, and GMOs were kicked out. That's what we're trying to engineer here with a massive education campaign.
Ah, okay. Well, you've given me some hope here, Jeffrey, because
in fact,
it was
I'm very optimistic because I've been working on this issue for 16 years, and I've never seen what we're seeing now. GMOs are more lively in the news. There's thousands of people, part of our Tipping Point network, which people can access at responsibletechnology.org. We have a shopping guide at nongmoshoppingguide.com and a free iPhone application called Shop No GMO. And these are very, very popular because the need now is to protect our own health and the health of our children who are most at risk as the information gets out. And I'll tell you one thing, that when I lecture to anyone in North America, whether it be doctors or food service directors or the general public, when I poll the audience before and after the lecture, that within 45 minutes, virtually everyone in the room has changed their diet, has become more vigilant at wanting to avoid GMOs. They may not have even heard of a GMO in the beginning, but when I describe the thousands of sick, sterile, and dead livestock, the damage to virtually every organ and every system studied, the toxic and allergic reactions in humans, the case studies, the increase in certain diseases since GMOs were introduced, and then I ask them how vigilant they'll be next week at avoiding GMOs. It is so remarkable that every single time we've seen dramatic changes on the spot in people's preference. And now we have a new film coming out this week called Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, and we think just watching the film will be sufficient to create this behavior change.
Is Monsanto, DuPont, and others coming after you?
Well, they're trying to discredit me. You see, in my second book, Genetic Roulette, I work with more than 30 scientists, and I had every page reviewed by at least 3 scientists, so it was absolutely as accurate as I could find, as I can produce it. And it was a complete, it did completely trash the claims by the biotech industry and caught them red-handed lying about their research. They have bad science down to a science. It's tobacco science. It's completely covering up ill health, and they're distorting and denying the evidence. So we caught them red-handed, and so what they did is they created a bogus website called Academics Review, and they say, this shows that we're reviewing Jeffrey Smith's book, and it has all these problems, and they're misquoting and misrepresenting the book they're supposedly challenging, and they're using self-contradictory, very, very weak and poor scientific arguments, but this is what they point to. So anyone who really knows science and looks at it realizes that they're just basically vapid and a facade.
Jeffrey Smith is with us here on The Conspiracy Show. We're talking about genetically modified organisms. They're in your food. You may not know it because it's not indicated on the label. However, a number of jurisdictions are trying to change that, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. But how can I make a decision? How can I decide, to go off genetically modified, a non-GMO diet is what I'm trying to say. How can I choose a non-GMO diet if I don't know what's on the label, Jeffrey?
Well, certainly labeling is going to be the easiest way, and there's about 49 countries that require labeling, and 40% of the world has that luxury or right enforced by the government. But in the United States and in Canada, you have to sort of figure it out. We have a shopping guide, and in the shopping guide, it gives you the 4 tips: buy organic, buy products that say non-GMO, buy products that are listed in our shopping guide, which happen to be third-party verified as non-GMO by the Non-GMO Project, or buy products without the at-risk ingredients. And so we have the list of the derivatives of soy and corn, which are rather extensive, as well as others, and it becomes a label reading exercise. So you can go and buy a spaghetti sauce that has olive oil instead of soybean oil or canola oil. When I go to a restaurant, I make sure they don't cook my stuff in canola oil or soybean oil because I don't want to be exposed to that because I know too much.
Once you're exposed, even if you've made the decision, isn't it too late?
Well, it's an interesting question. We know that the only human feeding study ever published showed that genes inserted into soybeans to make the soybeans Roundup Ready, not killable with Roundup, part of them transferred into the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines. And there was evidence that it continued to function, suggesting that it was continuing to function long after we stopped eating genetically engineered foods. And that, of course, is a very scary thing, especially if you think that the same gene transfer is going to happen in corn chips where you have genes engineered to produce this Bt toxin that breaks holes in our walls of our stomach, perhaps, and that may be the reason why 93% of the Canadian women tested had the Bt toxin in their blood, because their own gut bacteria was producing it day and night nonstop. Now, having said that, I'm happy to report that when we interview patients of doctors that prescribe non-GMO diets, they're getting better with dramatic improvements. One woman was 25 days into the diet. Within 3 days, a colitis disease which she had had for 30 years disappeared. Another person, irritable bowel, in a week and a half. Another person took 4 weeks. We had asthma gone, migraine headaches, infertility, restless leg syndrome. Now, one of the problems with humans avoiding GMOs, as we just discovered, is they may have to avoid some processed foods, they may have to switch to organic, and so there are cofactors which challenge the notion that it's the GMO removal that causes the improvement. But when the animals, the livestock, switch from genetically engineered corn and soy to non-GM corn and soy, the dramatic improvement does not have those conflicting cofactors, and when massive diarrhea problems that were fatal for one Danish pig farmer disappeared in 2 days, and his litter size increased, the conception rate increased, the birth defects disappeared, the deaths from bloats and ulcers disappeared. That was the genetically engineered component based on the fact that there were no cofactors. And we're seeing that over and over again with livestock and pets, and the same diseases and disorders which are going away in the animals and humans when they switch to non-GMO are the disorders and diseases that have been on the rise in North America since GMOs were introduced.
Has Monsanto, is there evidence, clear evidence, Jeffrey? We have to be careful. I know how litigious Monsanto can be, and you've experienced it firsthand, I'm sure. Is there clear-cut evidence that Monsanto and other companies that produce these GMOs have fudged data?
I was talking to a former Monsanto scientist, and he said that when rodents were fed genetically engineered corn and the rodents showed adverse reactions, instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. He told me also that 3 of his colleagues were doing safety studies on the milk from cows treated with Monsanto's bovine growth hormone. They found so much of a cancer-promoting hormone in the milk, the 3 scientists refused to drink milk thereafter. One bought his own cow. Now, as far as the covering up specifically, in my book, Genetic Roulette, in Part 3, I have 41 pages of how specifically Monsanto and others rig their research. So when they wanted to show that injections of bovine growth hormone into cows did not interfere with their fertility, according to documents stolen from the FDA and made public, it appeared that Monsanto actually invited cows into the study that were already pregnant before they were ever injected. I mean, there's a lot of very, very blatant rigging of research that we have exposed, the wrong detection methods, the wrong statistical methods, the wrong controls, and then when they still find deaths, disorders, and diseases in the animals that are fed GMOs, they dismiss them with completely unscientific support. But their regulators just parrot what the biotech industry says, and then we understand that many of the regulators are intimately connected with the biotech industry around the world.
Hold on, Jeffrey. We'll take a time out. Back with more on Frankenfoods here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
Big Brother is listening, and so are you, to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett. To speak with Richard, call 416-360-0740.
Jeffrey Smith stays with us. We're talking about genetically modified organisms. And again, you want to check out his website. It's responsibletechnology.org. And that film you said that's just been released this week, Jeffrey, on GMOs. Where can people see that?
Well, it's right now available for order at geneticroulettemovie.com. There's a trailer up there, so people can watch the trailer. We are not going to go through the normal channels and wait and try and get a theatrical release. Because of the California ballot initiative, it's an absolutely critical and pivotal event that can change the course of events this century and change the way Americans and Canadians eat. Because I think that when the companies are forced to disclose that they're using GM ingredients, they know that 53% of Americans say they would avoid GMOs if labeled. So I don't think these companies are going to stick around to wait to see if they're going to lose market share and goodwill. on July 1st, 2014, when the labels are required, I think they're going to be reorganizing their supply chain and having farmers grow non-genetically engineered products in order to meet the demands of humans who want to eat healthier non-GMO foods. So that's what I think is going to be going on right now.
A lot of allergies these days. You mentioned that earlier, but are peanuts genetically modified? Because I don't remember as a kid so many peanut allergies, and everywhere you turn now, someone has it can be deadly.
It's very interesting about peanuts. They're not genetically engineered, but they doubled the peanut allergy rate in the 5 years after genetically modified soybeans were introduced. Now, there is a cross-reactivity between soybeans and peanut allergies. So some people who are allergic to peanuts will be triggered by soybeans, and it may be possible that all the massive collateral damage in the soybeans, which increased a known allergen, trypsin inhibitor, by as much as 7-fold, which increased an anti-nutrient, it might have also enhanced this cross-reactivity. But also we know that the Bt toxin, when fed to mice, caused them to be sensitive or reactive to formerly harmless foods. And so it's possible that when you give genetic engineered crops or foods to individuals, they can become more sensitive or allergic to other items. And this also happened in another experiment with peas that never made it to the market, fortunately. Also, the genetically engineered soy, when fed to mice, it reduced the amount of pancreatic digestive enzymes produced. And so if that's the case, and it takes longer for proteins to be broken down, it gives a longer period of time for proteins to trigger an allergic reaction. So again, we may be seeing a compromised immune system for many reasons, and one we've already discussed. If the Bt toxin drills holes in the cell walls of our intestines and material that's not fully digested gets through the intestines into the bloodstream, that can lead to food allergies, autoimmune disease, inflammation, and some say autism and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and cancer, because leaky gut is so dangerous, according to many scientists and doctors.
All right, people are lining up on the lines here. Are you ready to take some calls?
Absolutely.
All right, Daniel is in West Virginia. Daniel, welcome to the Conspiracy Show.
Well, good evening. What I wanted to raise the subject about, as you were discussing, the Roundup Ready crops, of which the USDA is getting ready to greenlight Roundup Ready soybeans down here in the U.S., and we already have the Roundup Ready corn. I wanted to point out that Roundup its principal ingredient is glyphosate, which is popularly known as 2,4-D. And if you want the jawbreaker for the exact organo compound, I can give that to you. But that is 1/2 of the composition of Agent Orange. The other half is 2,4,5-T, which breaks down into a compound called TCDD, which is a dioxin, and has been called by some the most dangerous compound ever synthesized by man. Now, what happens when, especially 2,4,5-T, which is supposed to be banned from use in the United States, but I don't believe that it's enforced, in the presence of heat, it breaks down into this dioxin compound, and because they are both phenylacetic acids, 2,4-D will break into a similar compound in the presence of heat. I think that these are too dangerous a substance to be using indiscriminately on millions of acres of cropland in North America, let alone the rest of the world.
All right, Daniel, thank you for that information. Did you want to jump in on that, Jeffrey?
Sure, yes. Daniel, it's my understanding that glyphosate and 2,4-D are actually two different compounds. They may be related, but what's happening is with the spread of Roundup, and Roundup Ready soybeans have been in place since 1996, there's so much Roundup being sprayed, the actual increased number, the amount of herbicide increase in the first 16 years of GMOs is about 527 million pounds more because of the GMOs in the United States. That Roundup is found in the air samples, the rain samples, the water samples, the urine of city dwellers, and found in our bloodstream. It's found in the bloodstream of fetuses.
Oh, my word.
The overuse of it has caused superweeds, and so the effectiveness of Roundup is becoming less, and so now they want to introduce what we call Agent Orange crops, or those that are resistant to 2,4-D.
Oh, lovely. Hold on, Jeffrey.
Toxic.
I got to take a time out here.
Glyphosate.
Hold on, Jeffrey. I got to take a time out. We'll Indianapolis and New York checks in next with some questions. Jeffrey Smith, Genetically Modified Organisms, here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
The truth will set you free, but first, it'll really tick you off. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett.
Let me see if I heard that correctly. Agent Orange Ready crops. Is that what you said, Jeffrey? Agent Orange Ready crops?
Yes, the 2,4-D, which is half the component of Agent Orange, they actually have crops waiting to be approved that can drink this stuff for breakfast, which means we're going to see millions of pounds more of this very toxic ingredient. And in the process of making it, there's this side effects called dioxin, which the caller referred to, very, very dangerous. And not only that, but the 2,4-D can kind of vaporize and then move over to the friend's field and then drop down and kill that field as well. So it's a disaster waiting to happen.
Here's a very fundamental question. Can we now say that we no longer can count on the FDA in the United States and Health Canada to protect consumers?
Well, I don't know when we were able to do that. I remember knowing that an FDA commissioner said the one thing that bugs me is that people think the FDA is protecting them, and they're not. So even the founder of the FDA within 27 years was lamenting at how the corporations had taken over and that the FDA was really the enforcement wing of the corporations they were supposed to regulate. I know that in the USDA it's now run by Secretary Vilsack, who was the former Biotech Governor of the Year in 2001. We know that USAID was run by a Monsanto guy. The U.S. Trade Office for Agriculture is run by a biotech guy. We have a situation where it's hard to know where the White House and administration end and the biotech industry begins.
I don't think I'm over...
when they were protecting us, but I do know that it's been an abdication and not a regulation.
I was told by a former Health Canada official that they are told to refer to these companies that are seeking approval as clients.
Yes, I've talked to the Shiv Chopra and others, and yes, it was amazing. He said, no, the public should be the client. And they said, no, these are the companies, they're the clients. And there's a whole story about how Monsanto had allegedly offered a bribe to the Health Canada senior scientists by trying to get them to approve the bovine growth hormone without further study.
Jeffrey, I don't know if I'm overstating this, but this is starting to sound like corporate fascism.
Well, I think fascism is how corporations can run governments, and I think we certainly have the situation well in hand right now for that when it comes to biotechnology. When you look at the WikiLeaks for the U.S. government embassies, the ambassador to France basically called on Washington to create a retaliation list against countries resistant to GMOs, and that the action should, quote, cause some pain. The ambassador to Spain wrote to Washington saying, I met with the Monsanto director in the area, and we should come up with pressure on Brussels to force GMOs on Europe, and we should support the pro-GM forces within the Spanish government, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very, very blatant. It's explicit to promote biotechnology.
Well, now we know why the witch hunt for Julian Assange, and God bless Ecuador for offering him asylum. But I guess how long before the United States accuses Ecuador of harboring terrorists?
What they did with Ecuador, according to WikiLeaks, is to try and bring some of the Ecuadorian reporters to the U.S. so that they could be oriented by the biotech industry as to how to report on GMOs. I was in Taiwan recently and read to a press conference at Congress there to the reporters that were covering it how the U.S. had offered to bring the regulators from Taiwan to the United States, paying them $3,000 each, and then have Monsanto and others teach them how to regulate GMOs.
My word. Let's say hello to Pat in Indianapolis. Pat, welcome to The Conspiracy Show.
Hi there, folks. How are you tonight?
Well, thank you.
I've been listening through most of the program, and Jeff has mainly talked about Monsanto in the chemical field, and then DuPont, which had to bail Pioneer out because Pioneer squandered some things on test research and everything, and that's how they got a hold of Pioneer. Company I used to be affiliated with there in Indianapolis, had a competing product against Monsanto that called Treflan. And that was produced by Eli Lilly and Company and sold through its other division identified as Elanco Products. We did have some of those chemicals which you mentioned earlier, only the most dangerous one was PCTB. I can't even pronounce it. It had 52 letters on it. The compound was manufactured by Hooker Chemical up there in Niagara Falls, New York, and then shipped by tank car down to the plant in Lafayette. Well, once we got it, we discovered there was a lot of cancer-causing carcinogens to it. And we had to run it through three additional refining refining processes, where we were able to capture maybe 60 to 70% of the bad material, but we never could get it all. The other compound that was produced was, at that time, American Oil, which is now BP Industrial Products, down there in Texas City. It, too, had some bad ingredients, but not as bad as that Hooker compound.
Did they nonetheless receive FDA approval, Pat?
They were able to garner FDA approval.
There you go. Well, now, what more needs to be said?
We got into some big troubles with their pharmaceutical manufacturing, and they had to sell part of Elanco off. In fact, the formula at Lilly was, as Treflan went, so went Elanco, and as the profits of Elanco went, so went the profits of Eli Lilly.
All right, Pat, listen, I have to cut in here because we're running short on time. This is all amazing information. Let me get Jeffrey in here before I move on to the next call. Jeffrey, did you want to respond to anything that Pat has brought up?
Yeah, we know that Eli Lilly has been sued for misbranding and mismarketing. And when they were trying to get bovine growth hormone approved, they were in competition with Monsanto. I talked to a former FDA regulator, and he said that Eli Lilly had sort of rigged their research and violated good standard practices to try and pretend that their bovine growth hormone was okay. Well, they didn't end up marketing it. Only Monsanto did, but then Monsanto sold it off to Eli Lilly, so birds of a feather.
All right, up next is Karen in New York. Welcome to the Conspiracy Show, Karen.
Yes, hi. My question's pretty basic. I remember when I first heard about this and actually went to some USDA trainings as a paraprofessional and was being told that this was perfectly safe. You know, there was no problem with GMOs. But I also was skeptical at the time, and I've heard that in the case of corn and soybean, it's almost like horses out of the barn, and it's almost impossible to avoid it now because other fields can be, whether it's from drift or whatever, can be affected. Is that true?
Well, once you release the genes into the gene pool, it's a self-propagating genetic pollution, and there's no way to fully clean up the gene pool. It can outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. But if we removed GMOs from the market now, the exposure would go from massive to tiny. It wouldn't go to zero. So right now, if you buy organic products, they're not allowed to intentionally contain GMOs, but some may have tiny amounts of contamination. Likewise, the non-GMO Project verified products, even though they've been tested and verified to meet the standards, may have a tiny amount of contamination. This is one of the tragic aspects. The biotech industry years ago claimed that we would more likely get pregnant from a toilet seat than have a non-GMO plant be cross-pollinated by a GMO. And, of course, they knew that wasn't true. They just tried to shame anyone that thought it was. Now they say, oh, yeah, it's inevitable, but it's not important.
If I have an organic farm, and I can't remember if you mentioned alfalfa was a GM, a genetically modified crop.
Yes, it is an alfalfa, yes.
Let's say I'm growing organic alfalfa for the organic beef cattle industry. And so I want to ship that organic alfalfa as feed to a beef farmer. And a couple of concessions over, is an alfalfa a farm that is where the plants are genetically modified. And one of those seeds, or you have this drift, right? And now my crops are contaminated.
And you may just be violating the law, because according to the Canadian Supreme Court, when this happened with canola contaminating Percy Schmeiser's farm, Monsanto sued him.
For patent?
When he saved his seeds and replanted it, it violated the intellectual property rights against Monsanto's patent, and so you may have to turn over all of your property to the company that contaminated your seeds.
Unbelievable. I was going to argue the other way. I was going to argue, since I would theoretically lose my organic designation, don't I have any recourse? Couldn't I sue them? But you're saying they'll sue me for patent infringement and take my crops.
That is, according to the Canadian Supreme Court, and you can read the judgment against Percy Schmeiser. Yes. Now, I am hoping that someone will actually test the opposite and in the courts and see what they say then, because it's obvious that the non-GMO and organic farmers are really being clobbered by the introduction of GMOs, which can threaten their very business model.
Jeffrey, I don't know if you know Thomas Pollock, the author of The End of Food.
No, I don't.
He's definitely someone you should get in touch with. Lives up near Ottawa. Wrote this book, The End of Food. Talks about the dangers of GMOs. Worked at a fairly prestigious university. He can't prove it, but believes he was let go because for 30 years he's been writing about these sorts of things, and believes that big food exerted a great deal of pressure on the university, and out he went. Again, he can't prove it. But he talked about alfalfa and wrote an article and tried to sell it to an Alberta newspaper, because obviously cattle next to oil is huge in Alberta, and wanted to warn the farmers about the encroachment of genetically engineered alfalfa. The editors of the newspaper weren't interested. They said, "We don't have time for this. We're in the midst of an election."
Yes.
This is the frustration.
The media is actually controlled in part by the advertising. And it actually gets worse. I mean, it's not just the fact that it's genetically engineered. Now there's a group of scientists that have discovered a new organism the size of a virus that appears to be causing infertility and spontaneous abortions in livestock, and comes from feed that has been sprayed with Roundup. So the Roundup increases the presence of this organism, according to the research to date. Now, there was a letter written to Secretary Vilsack of January last year urging him not to approve Roundup Ready alfalfa, because more Roundup could just exacerbate this problem, which is already potentially epidemic proportions in livestock and possibly in humans, and it was completely ignored. They said they ignored the plea to not approve Roundup Ready alfalfa, and they did not follow up with research by the USDA on something that these very highly credentialed scientists had pointed out as an emergency.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you for this last hour, and I'm sure that a lot of people's ears have pricked up, and they're going to be anxious to see this film that's coming out. Again, how is it? How can they screen it? GeneticRouletteMovie.com. It's called Genetic Roulette: The Gamble of Our Lives. And also, for those that want to avoid GMOs, I hope everyone, non-GMOshoppingguide.com. Jeffrey, thank you again. Thank you. Jeffrey Smith, and his website, responsibletechnology.org. And listen, if you're upset about this, go to your grocery store, talk to the manager there, and say, we don't want GMOs in our food. And as always, you can check out information on this show and upcoming shows on the website www.richardsyrett.com.